Hello and welcome to this episode of the REBT Advocates with Dr. Mike R. Adelstein of TheREBT.Life. You can find his book, 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life at TheREBT.Life. And me, Tommy Bateman, a counselor in Virginia. If you want counseling from us, hey, email us at rebtadvocates@gmail.com. You can send requests, you can send hate, you can send comments, send what you want. We would just love to hear from you. Today we have a wonderful guest, John Vespasian, author of excuse me, I got something caught in my throat there. The 10 Principles of Rational Living. Michael, before we get started, anything you want to say?
Yes. And in addition to getting counseling from me or Tommy, you can get counseling from both of us by
Sure.
coming on our program and bringing up an issue, and we'll both help you. And then you'll be doubly rational. And I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I have 40 years experience helping people with REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, the subject of our episodes. And you can find my practice link and the link to my book, 3-Minute Therapy, in the description below.
All right. So at this time, we get the pleasure of introducing our guest, author John Vespasian. As I said, the author of the 10 Principles for Rational Living, among others. And we're going to have an Amazon link or a link to where you can get some of his books below. So, John, how are you?
Hi, Tommy. Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Hi, you're welcome. And just to add a little more about Tommy, Tommy has written a number of, John has written a number of books on personal development, usually based in examples from history. So you can role model your own personal development on some historical figures. John, do you have any YouTube's interviews that people could go to and get more information in addition to reading
Yes,
your
there are
book,
few,
The 10
there are few
Principles
interviews
of
on
Rational
YouTube.
Living?
Yes, there are a few interviews on YouTube. If you just type my name on Google, John Vespasian, you can easily find more than 100 interviews. So I'm very, very easy to find.
Okay, very good. And that's Vespasian, Vespasian.
Excellent.
Okay,
So,
John, would you like to give us an overview of your book, who the audience is, and what you mean by rational?
Yes, basically I'm trying to promote rationality already for a number of years since I started to write books. From the perspective that I find very difficult for people, for myself, and in general for people, to make better decisions by using abstractions. The traditional methodology I think you use in psychotherapy is that you try to dispute irrational beliefs and you try to actually promote better ideas. I find it very difficult to do unless you have extensive training. For most people, it's very difficult, I think, to dispute their own irrationality. So the methodology I'm using in my books is to take a look at history, to take a look at successful people, happy people in many different contexts, different centuries, different professions, and try to show the patterns of behavior and the patterns of thinking that prove successful, that tend to be very rational, tend to be very logical, especially when people are facing adversity, when they are fired from a job or they are severely sick, they go through divorce. Is very difficult. I think it's extremely difficult for human beings to stay rational, to stay calm. And what I'm trying to do in the books is by means of examples to show how this can be done, how you can recover. So my way of promoting rationality is basically by using history.
Very good, very good. How are you defining rational?
For me, rational is evidence-based. And at the same time that you use logic, you have to widen your view. I think the problem with most of us when we make stupid decisions and we make harmful, counterproductive decisions, we tend to be easily influenced by one or two factors, and we forget to look at the rest. Let me just give you an example from the books to see what I mean by rational thinking. the story that actually started me writing is a story from the 19th century that I found very intriguing. It's the story of Howard Carter. He was a very famous archaeologist. When he found the tomb of Tutankhamun was a lost pharaoh. And the story is very intriguing because Carter, for almost 15 years, he was savagely criticized by newspapers, by experts. Everybody was telling him that what he was looking for did not exist, or if it existed, it had been found a long time ago. So basically, he was working against the great majority of experts. He was ridiculed. He was basically marginalized constantly. He lived in the desert. He was making holes on the ground almost 14 years without finding anything. And I found the story very impressive because how do you explain that this guy who was basically alone with maybe one or two supporters, he didn't get depressed, he didn't get anxious, he didn't get a nervous breakdown. This is extremely unusual because most people cannot even withstand a strong opposition for a couple of days. And this guy did it 14 years. And I found the story impossible to believe. So I researched it and I found an explanation that is basically is the bone, the thread that goes through the book. Why was Carter able to remain rational in a very, very difficult situation? And the explanation is that against the very hostile environment, Carter remained rational because he was basically checking the facts. What most people actually don't do in their real lives, because we tend to be very easily swayed by emotions. Carter actually took the trouble to learn to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, this sign language, to check the ancient sources. He checked actually the inscriptions on the temples, and they told him that Tutankhamun was buried in this valley. So he had the sources. And even if everybody was telling him that he was crazy, that he was useless, that he was ignorant, he was just maintaining his rationality, his objectivity, his motivation, because he had a context. And I think eventually when he found it, and he found it after 10 years of trial and error, he was proven right. And this is a story that you find different versions in history, in every century, in every profession, in every situation, that people tend to be easily swayed by their emotions, by their short-term thinking, because they lose sight of the context, they lose their objectivity. And I think through therapy, you can make people more rational, but I think also through history, by looking at biographies of real people, we can learn a lot and we can develop this sensitivity towards the context.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. We have a example closer to our REBT hearts, and that's Albert Ellis, because when Albert Ellis first came up with this new approach to therapy against the traditional approach that was very popular at the time in the 50s, he was also ridiculed and marginalized and was in a hostile environment. And the way we explain his resilience is he convinced himself he didn't absolutely need the approval of others, that it would be nice, but he had a higher goal, and that is to get the word out. So in a sense, it's what you're saying, based on evidence and logic, his own evidence, and doing therapy himself, he discovered a new method and did not give into criticism because he didn't convince himself that he must have the approval of others, and didn't put himself down. I'm a loser because people are disapproving of me, but rather recognized that if people disapprove of you, there are advantages and disadvantages. And for him, the advantages of getting the truth out outweigh the disadvantages of the disapproval.
Yeah, another point that I really underline in my books is that you have to be very careful with positive thinking, which is, I think, so prevalent in American culture. I think it's extremely dangerous. I think it's part of the explanation why you have 50 million people in the US taking medication against stress, anxiety, depression. People sometimes become extremely unrealistic from watching, I think, too much TV, too many movies. They tend to believe stories that are not true, and they tend to have expectations that are wildly unrealistic. And again, they will crash against the wall, and they will become, I think, dysfunctional. And this is something that in history you see also very often. In one of my books, for instance, I think in this one, I recount the story of Vivaldi. Was a great musician, and Vivaldi was also a victim in a way of positive thinking, because he was making good money. He had a job in Venice. He was a teacher, a music teacher. He was composing music and being very successful. And eventually, someone pushed him with the idea that, oh, you're brilliant, you can do anything. And he actually quit his job. He quit his situation, very good situation in Venice. And eventually, he tried to create a market for giving concerts in Europe, and basically he starved. He was a complete failure for the last years of his life. He was trying to make a living in a market that did not exist yet. And I think this happens to many people. Unfortunately, they are pushed by propaganda to do things that are extremely difficult. They do not realize the odds. And I think when you look at history, when you look at the real story, it's very important to be prudent, to develop a sense of reality, because otherwise you will inevitably end up depressed and possibly bankrupt. And I think our culture is shamelessly pushing positive thinking. And I think people should be warned about the dangers, because it certainly makes many people to become massively irrational.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Avoid positive thinking and negative thinking, but look at the positive ideas and look at the negative ideas, and make your mind up yourself by weighing the two. So I think what you say, John, is an important point. One of the things you mentioned in one of your chapters is ignore most of what you hear. And I have a somewhat different view, and that is listen to what you hear, but then think critically about it. So simply because you don't ignore it, that doesn't necessarily mean you adopt it. Did you have a thought on that, Tommy?
Oh, not right away. I'm very interested in what John will have to say here.
Well, what I'm trying to say in this chapter is that we tend to have an overload of information. I think we see the situation today where people are really bombarded with fear messages from this COVID situation. And for many people, this has created massive panic, massive paranoia. And I think it's good to stay informed, to take a look at the news. I think you should always have a few sources of news, not just one. You should check, I think, the headlines of a couple of newspapers or a couple of news sources, but don't overdo it. Because especially the most popular media, I mean, these news stories, they tend to be extremely emotional. They tend to deal with doom and gloom. They tend to scare people, because this makes the stories very compelling. But you have to be careful, because I know many people who by watching these stories constantly, they develop a rather paranoid attitude, and they are constantly fearful of everything. They are constantly talking about conspiracy theories. You have to be careful, because information most of the time has an agenda behind it. And I think you have to really filter it. You could spend your whole day watching very interesting news, interesting stories that in the end will have no impact on your life. So I think if you want to live effectively, I think you have to be effective in the sources of information and the time you devote to them. Do not spend your life listening to very skillful speakers who are basically promoting fear and doom and gloom. It makes people unnecessarily anxious, unnecessarily depressed. I think it's a very bad habit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like that you have the opportunity to use that filter to not only with but with your previous point about positive thinking. You have a problem with these people, these hucksters that are saying things like you can do anything if you just put your mind to it and all that. And perhaps instead of looking at what they're saying, we need to take it with a grain of salt and look at what the evidence actually is and what is possible, what is probable, and move on from there. Is that something that you see as well, John?
Absolutely. It's just that it's so difficult to stay balanced, especially when you have all the colleagues and the friends, and they are all scared, and it happens. It's the same in the stock market. Huh? If you have I think it's a good lesson. I always think I recommend in my books. I mean, even if you invest $100 per month, get involved in the stock market, because it will really open your eyes. You will read the news from a very different perspective. You will become, I think, more intelligent financially, because you will actually start to look at business and trade and from a different perspective. And I think if people spend a little bit more time reading financial news or reading actually a bit of economics, which is very simple. I mean, if you really put some time, it's very simple. They will avoid huge mistakes in their careers and in their personal finances. And it's a pity that people leave the college or the secondary school, they leave it with almost total ignorance of economics. And this creates, unfortunately, a very narrow mentality where people become very local, they become very much afraid of foreigners, and this is really very bad. I think to have the possibility to invest worldwide today, and the possibility to learn languages, which is another thing that I really promote in my books, will really create opportunities, will make you less dependent on local sources, and I think will make you more rational, because you will have visibility and you will have sensitivity for other possibilities that people who typically have this narrow mentality, narrow mind, village mentality, they easily get scared. They easily get massively irrational, massively extreme in their ideas. This is, I think, very dangerous for them, and very dangerous also maybe for their neighbors.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing to watch out for is that it's not being bombarded by fear messages, which makes people anxious, but it's their thinking about it. So when you're bombarded with fear messages, you have a choice. You can go along with it and then make yourself fearful, or you can see through it and not take it too seriously and not make yourself fearful. So I think an important thing through all this is to see that people have agency, and when people have emotions and fear emotions, it's their doing. It's not the fault of people who bombard them with fear that forces them to feel fear, but they can evaluate those messages and think for themselves about it. Another thing you mentioned in there is in chapter 10, which is called Develop Strong Long-Term Passions, which I think is very important, and we agree very much with that. In that chapter, you mentioned comparing yourself with other people makes no sense, and and I agree that comparing your total self with other people makes no sense, but it does make sense to use people's behavior as role models. So for example, Tommy knows a lot about religion, and if I were to study religion, I would use him as a role model to get more knowledgeable about religion. That doesn't mean I'm comparing myself to his personhood, but I'm comparing a trait of mine, ignorance about religion, to Tommy's strength in knowledge about religion, and using that as an incentive. So it's okay to use people as role models in terms of their behavior, but don't compare yourself and put yourself up or down based on how you're doing in comparison with others. Okay, Tommy or John, did either of you have any final words?
Well, I do have a question
Yes,
about
I would like to underline just another principle that comes in the books, I think very strongly, is that you can make better decisions in life, and I think you can become more rational if you acquire the habit of thinking in terms of a lifetime, where more people are going to live today easily 80, 90 years. Some people are going to become 100 years old. When you have to make an important decision, like choosing your career, deciding whom to marry, deciding whether you're going to do an investment or you buy a house, try to think long term. Don't get into the habit, you get it constantly, just do it, when you get this message constantly from the media. If people get this attitude of thinking, okay, I'm going to live 90 years old, I'm going to live 80, 90 years, 95, you will see your problems and your mistakes and your deficiencies more philosophically. And when you make an error and when you just screw up and then you lose a job or you make a bad investment or you marry the wrong person, you will see that the problem can be remedied. It might take you a few months or a couple of years to get over it and to start a new career or to start a new business. But in the end, when you look at these problems from the perspective of a lifetime, they become very small because you will have decades ahead of yourself to really solve the problems, to become more rational, to become more effective, to learn new skills, to build a business. And this exaggerated focus on the short term, I think, is one of the reasons why people make such bad decisions, why they have emotional disturbance. It's very difficult to acquire the habit of thinking long term because it's against our culture. But I think it's one of the most valuable things you can do for yourself. And this is something that I think if you learn from history, if you read biographies, if you read books such as mine, you get this perspective because you see people making mistakes, you see people in difficult situations and how they recover. And eventually, after a few years, they become very successful. I think try to think in terms of a lifetime is one of the best things you can do for yourself. Try to get this habit because you will avoid a massive number of mistakes.
Okay, very good. Tommy, were you going to say something?
yeah. One of the things I just wanted to say is that I really enjoy this your methodology, and that it doesn't necessarily it's not in conflict with REBT really at all. It seems like a practical look at the examples of rational livers, and livers as in our people that have lived those lives, not our organ, but people have rational people in history, and then you can work backwards what they have done. Whereas REBT, we start with our irrational thinking, work forwards, uh, showing a methodology of thinking more rationally. I think they're great to work together because your books can show that rational living is also possible. So I enjoyed it. And guys, if you want to read more about John and his books, we'll have a link below to his resources.
And the book we've been discussing of John's, which sounds fascinating, is called, let's see, I just lost the title here. It's
The 10
here it
Principles
is.
for Rational Living.
10 Principles for Rational Living. Thank you, Tommy. 10 Principles for Rational Living. And thank you, John, so much for coming on with us. It was very interesting. And I think, as Tommy said, you add another dimension to rational emotive behavior therapy.
Many thanks, Michael. Many thanks, Tommy.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like below, thumbs up, comment, and suggest subjects. And as we mentioned, you can volunteer, come on and get the benefit of 2 REBT minds for the price of 1, actually for the price of none, since there's no charge. And to help support us, donate to Patreon and subscribe to the REBT Advocates to stay on the rational side of life.